Robin by Jim Corbett from the Man-Eaters of Kumaon. Read by Vijay Raol. I never saw either of his parents. The knight of the broom I purchased him from said he was a spaniel, and that his name was Pincha, and that his father was a keen gun dog. This is all I can tell you about his pedigree. I did not want a pup, and it was quite by accident that I happened to be with a friend when the litter of 7 was decanted from a very filthy basket for her inspection. Pincha was the smallest and the thinnest of the litter, and it was quite evident that he had reached the last ditch in his fight for survival. Leaving his little less miserable brothers and sisters, he walked once round me and then curled himself up between my big feet. When I picked him up and put him inside my coat, it was a bitterly cold morning. He tried to show his gratitude by licking my face, and I tried to show him I was not aware of his appalling stench. He was rising 3 months then, and I bought him for 15 rupees. He's rising 13 years now, and all the gold in India would not buy him. When I got him home, and he had made his first acquaintance with a square meal, warm water, and soap, we scrapped his kennel name of Pincha and rechristened him Robin, in memory of a faithful old collie who had saved my young brother, aged 4, and myself, aged 6, from the attack of an infuriated she-bear. Robin responded to regular meals as parched land does to rain, and after he had been with us for a few weeks, acting on the principle that a boy's and pup's training cannot be started too early, I took him out one morning, intending to get a little away from him and fire a shot or two to get him used to the sound of gunfire. At the lower end of our estate, there are some dense thorn bushes, and while I was skirting around them, a peafowl got up, and forgetting all about Robin, who was following at heel, I brought the bird fluttering down. It landed in the thorn bushes, and Robin dashed in after it. The bushes were too thick and too thorny for me to enter them, so I ran around to the far side, where, beyond the bushes was open ground, and beyond that again heavy tree and grass jungle, which I knew the wounded bird would make for. The open ground was flooded with morning sunlight, and if I'd been armed with a movie camera, I should have had an opportunity of securing a unique picture. The peafowl, an old hen with neck feathers stuck out at right angles and one broken wing, was making for the tree jungle, while Robin, with stern to the ground, was hanging on to her tail and being dragged along. Running forward, I very foolishly caught the bird by the neck and lifted it clear off the ground, whereon it promptly lashed out with both legs and sent Robin heels over head. In a second he was up and on his feet again, and when I laid the dead bird down, he danced round it, making little dabs alternatively at its head and tail. The lesson was over for that morning, and as we returned home, it would have been difficult to say which of us was the more proud, Robin at bringing home his first bird, or I at having picked a winner out of a filthy basket. The shooting season was now drawing to a close, and for the next few days, Robin was not given anything larger than quail, doves, and an occasional partridge to retrieve. We spent the summer on the hills, and on our annual migration to the foothills in November, at the end of a long 15-mile march, as we turned a sharp corner, one of a big troop of langurs jumped off the hillside and crossed the road a few inches in front of Robin's nose. Disregarding my whistle, Robin dashed down the khud side after the langur, which promptly sought safety in a tree. The ground was open with a few trees here and there, and after going steeply down for 30 or 40 yards, flattened out for a few yards before going sharply down into the valley below. On the right-hand side of this flat ground, there were a few bushes with a deep channel scoured out by rainwater running through them. Robin had hardly entered these bushes when he was out again, and with ears laid back and tail tucked in, was running for dear life, with an enormous leopard bounding after him and gaining on him at every bound. I was unarmed, and all the assistance I could render was to hoe and haw at the full extent of my lungs. The men carrying M's dandy joined in lustily, the pandemonium reaching its climax when the 100 or more langurs added their alarm calls in varying keys. For 25 or 30 yards the desperate and unequal race continued, and just as the leopard was within reach of Robin, it unaccountably swerved and disappeared into the valley, while Robin circled round the shoulder of the hill and rejoined us on the road. Two very useful lessons Robin learned from his hairbreadth escape, which he never in his afterlife forgot. First, that it was dangerous to chase langurs, and second, that the alarm call of a langur denoted the presence of a leopard. Robin resumed his training, where it had been interrupted in spring, but it soon became apparent that his early neglect and starvation had affected his heart, for he fainted now after the least exertion. There is nothing more disappointing for a gun dog than to be left at home when his master goes out, and as a bird shooting was now taboo for Robin, I started taking him with me when I went out after big game. He took to this new form of sport as readily as duck takes to water, and from then on has accompanied me whenever I have been out with a rifle. The method we employ is to go out early in the morning, pick up the tracks of a leopard or tiger, and follow them. When the pug marks can be seen, I do the tracking, and when the animal we are after takes to the jungle, Robin does the tracking. In this way, we have on occasion followed an animal for miles before coming up with it. When shooting on foot, it is very much easier to kill an animal outright than when shooting down on it from a machan or from the back of an elephant. For one thing, when wounded animals have to be followed up on foot, chance shots are not indulged in, and for another, the vital parts are more accessible when shooting on the same level as the animal than when shooting down on it. However, even after exercising the greatest care over the shot, I have sometimes only wounded leopards and tigers who have rampaged round before being quietened by a second or third shot, and only once during all the years we have shot together has Robin left me in a tight corner. When he rejoined me after his brief absence that day, we decided that the incident was closed and would never be referenced to again. But we are older now and possibly less sensitive. Anyway, Robin, who has exceeded the canine equivalent of 80 years and 10, and who lies at my feet as I write, on a bed he will never again leave, has with a smile from his wise brown eyes and a wag of his small tump of a tail given me permission to go ahead and tell you the story. We did not see the leopard until it stepped clear of the thick undergrowth and, coming to a stand, looked down over its left shoulder. He was an outsized male with a beautiful dark glossy coat, the rosettes on his skin standing out like clear-cut designs on a rich velvet ground. I had an unharried shot with an accurate rifle at his right shoulder, at the shot range of 15 yards. By how little I missed his heart makes no matter, and while the bullet was kicking up the dust 50 yards away, he was high in the air and turning a somersault, landed in the thick undergrowth he had a minute before left. For 20, 40, 50 yards we heard him crashing through the cover, and then the sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. This sudden cessation of sound could be accounted for in two ways. Either the leopard had collapsed and died in his tracks, or 50 yards away he had reached open ground. We had walked far that day, and the sun was near setting, and we were still 4 miles from home. This part of the jungle was not frequented by man, and there was not one chance in a million of anyone passing that way by night. And last, the best reason of all for leaving the leopard, M was unarmed and could neither be left alone nor taken along to follow up the wounded animal. So we turned to the north and made for home. There was no need for me to mark the spot, for I had walked through these jungles by day and often by night, for near on half a century, and could have found my way blindfold to any part of them. Night had only just given place to the following morning when Robin, who had not been with us the previous evening, and I arrived at the spot I had fired from. Very warily, Robin, who was leading, examined the ground where the leopard had stood, and then raising his head and sniffing the air, he advanced to the edge of the undergrowth where the leopard, in falling, had left great splashes of blood. There was no need for me to examine the blood to determine the position of the wound, for at the short range I had fired at, I had seen the bullet strike, and the spurt of dust on the far side was proof that the bullet had gone right through the leopard's body. It might be necessary later on to follow up the blood trail, but just at present a little rest after our 4-mile walk in the dark would do no harm, and might on the other hand prove of great value to us. The sun was near rising, and at the early hour of the morning all the jungle folk were on the move, and it would be advisable to hear what they had to say on the subject of the wounded animal before going further. Under a nearby tree, I found a dry spot to which the saturating dew had not penetrated, and with Robin stretched out at my feet, had finished my cigarette when a chital hind, and then a second and a third started calling some 60 yards to our left front. Robin sat up and slowly turning his head looked at me, and, on catching my eye, as slowly turned back in the direction of the calling deer. He had traveled far along the road of experience since the day he had first heard the alarm call of the langur, and he knew now, as did every bird and animal within hearing, that the chital were warning the jungle folk of the presence of a leopard. From the manner in which the chital were calling, it was evident that the leopard was in full view of them. A little more patience and they would tell us if he was alive. They had been calling for about 5 minutes when suddenly, and all together, they called once and again and then settled down to their regular call. The leopard was alive and had moved, and was now quiet again. All that we needed to know now was the position of the leopard, and this information we could get by stalking the chital. Moving downwind for 50 yards, we entered the thick undergrowth and started to stalk the deer. Not a difficult task, for Robin can move through any jungle as silently as a cat, and long practice has taught me where to place my feet. The chital were not visible until we were within a few feet of them. They were standing in the open and looking towards the north in the exact direction, as far as I was able to judge, in which the crashing sound of the evening before had ceased. Up to this point, the chital had been of great help to us. They had told us the leopard was lying out in the open and that it was alive, and they had now given us the direction. It had taken us the best part of an hour to acquire this information, and if the chital now caught sight of us and warned the jungle folk of our presence, they would in 1 second undo the good they had so far done. I was debating whether it would be better to retrace our steps and work down below the calling deer and try to get a shot from behind them, or move them from our vicinity by giving the call of a leopard, when one of the hinds turned her head and looked straight into my face. Next second, with a cry of, "Where, man?" they dashed away at top speed. I had only about 5 yards to cover to reach the open ground, but quick as I was, the leopard was quicker, and I was only in time to see his hindquarters and tail disappearing behind some bushes. The chital had very effectively spoilt my chance of a shot, and the leopard would now have to be located and marked down all over again, this time by Robin. I stood on the open ground for some minutes, to give the leopard time to settle down and the scent he had left in his passage to blow past us, and then took Robin due west across the track of the wind, which was blowing from the north. We had gone about 60 or 70 yards when Robin, who was leading, stopped and turned to face into the wind. Robin is mute in the jungles and has a wonderful control over his nerves. There is one nerve, however, running down the back of his hind legs which he cannot control when he is looking at a leopard, or when the scent of a leopard is warm and strong. The nerve was now twitching and agitating the long hair on the upper part of his hind legs. A very violent cyclonic storm had struck this part of the forest the previous summer, uprooting a number of trees. It was towards one of these fallen trees 40 yards from where we were standing that Robin was now looking. The branches were towards us, and on either side of the trunk there were light bushes and a few scattered tufts of short grass. At any other time, Robin and I would have made straight for our quarry, but on this occasion a little extra caution was advisable. Not only were we dealing with an animal who, when wounded, knows no fear, but in addition we were dealing with a leopard who had 15 hours in which to nurse his grievance against man, and who could, in consequence, be counted on to have all his fighting instincts thoroughly aroused. When leaving home that morning, I had picked up the .275 rifle I had used the previous evening. A good rifle to carry when miles have to be covered, but not the weapon one would select to deal with a wounded leopard. So instead of a direct approach, I picked a line that would take us 15 yards from and parallel to the fallen tree. Step by step, Robin leading, we moved along this line and had passed the branches and were opposite the trunk when Robin stopped. Taking the direction from him, I presently saw what had attracted his attention. The tip of the leopard's tail slowly raised and as slowly lowered, the warning a leopard invariably gives before charging. Pivoting to the right on my heels, I had just got the rifle to my shoulder when the leopard burst through the intervening bushes and sprang at us. My bullet, fired more with the object of deflecting him than with any hope of killing or even hitting him, passed under his belly and went through the fleshy part of his left thigh. The crack of the rifle, more than the wound, had the effect of deflecting the leopard sufficiently to make him pass my right shoulder without touching me, and before I could get in another shot, he disappeared into the bushes beyond. Robin had not moved from my feet, and together we now examined the ground the leopard had passed over. Blood we found in plenty, but whether it had come from the old wounds torn open by the leopard's violent exertions, or from my recent shot, it was impossible to say. Anyway, it made no difference to Robin, who, without a moment's hesitation, took up the trail. After going through some very heavy cover, we came on knee-high undergrowth and had proceeded about a couple of 100 yards when I saw the leopard get up in front of us, and before I could get the rifle to bear on him, he disappeared under a lantana bush. This bush, with its branches resting on the ground, was as big as a cottage tent, and in addition to affording the leopard ideal cover, gave him all the advantages for launching his next attack. Robin and I had come very well out of our morning's adventure, and it would have been foolish now, armed as I was, to pursue the leopard further. So without more ado, we turned about and made for home. Next morning, we were back on the ground. From a very early hour, Robin had been agitating to make a start, and ignoring all the interesting smells the jungle holds in the morning, would have made me do the 4 miles at a run had that been possible. I had armed myself with a .450-400, and it was in consequence feeling much happier than I had done the previous day. When we were several hundred yards from the lantana bush, I made Robin slow down and advance cautiously, for it is never safe to assume that wounded animal will be found where it has been left hours previously, as the following regrettable incident shows. A sportsman of my acquaintance wounded a tiger one afternoon and followed the blood trail for several miles along a valley. Next morning, accompanied by a number of men, one of whom was carrying his empty rifle and leading the way, he set out, intending to take up the tracking where he had left off. His way led over the previous day's blood trail, and while still a mile from the spot where the tiger had been left, the leading man, who incidentally was the local shikari, walked on to the wounded tiger and was killed. The rest of the party escaped, some by climbing trees, and others by showing a clean pair of heels. I had marked the exact position of the lantana bush, and now took Robin along a line that would pass a few hundred yards on the lee side of it. Robin knew all that was worth knowing about this method of locating the position of an animal by cutting across the wind, and we had only gone a short distance and were still 100 yards from the bush when he stopped, turned, and faced into the wind, and communicated to me that he could smell the leopard. As on the previous day, he was facing a fallen tree which was lying along the edge of and parallel to the thick undergrowth through which we had followed the leopard to the lantana bush after he had charged us. On our side of the tree the ground was open, but on the far side there was a dense growth of waist-high basonta bushes. Having signaled to Robin to carry on along our original line, we went past the lantana bush, in which he showed no interest, to a channel washed out by rainwater. Here, removing my coat, I filled it with as many stones as the stitches would hold, and with this improvised sack slung over my shoulder, returned to the open ground near the tree. Resuming my coat, and holding the rifle ready for instant use, I took up a position 15 yards from the tree and started throwing the stones, first onto the tree and then into the bushes on the far side of it, with the object of making the leopard, assuming he was still alive, charge on to the open ground where I could deal with him. When all my ammunition was exhausted, I coughed, clapped my hands, and shouted, and neither during the bombardment nor after it did the leopard move or make any sound to indicate that he was alive. I should now have been justified in walking straight up to the tree and looking on the far side of it, but remembering an old jungle saying, "It is never safe to assume that a leopard is dead until he has been skinned," I set out to circle around the tree, intending to reduce the size of the circle until I could see right under the branches and along the whole length of the trunk. I made the radius of the first circle about 25 yards and had gone 2/3 of the way round when Robin stopped. As I looked down to see what had attracted his attention, there was a succession of deep-throated, angry grunts, and the leopard made straight for us. All I could see was the undergrowth being violently agitated in direct line towards us, and I only just had time to swing half right and bring the rifle up when the head and shoulders of the leopard appeared out of the bushes a few feet away. The leopard's spring and my shot were simultaneous, and sidestepping to the left and leaning back as far as I could, I fired the second barrel from my hip into his side as he passed me. When a wounded animal, be he leopard or tiger, makes a headlong charge and fails to contact, he invariably carries on and does not return to the attack until he is again disturbed. I had sidestepped to the left to avoid crushing Robin, and when I looked down for him now, he was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in all the years we had hunted together, we had parted company in a tight corner, and he was now probably trying to find his way home, with very little chance of being able to avoid the many dangers that lay before him in the intervening 4 miles of jungle. Added to the natural dangers he would have to face in jungle, with which, owing to its remoteness from home, he was not familiar, was the weak condition of his heart, and it was therefore with very great misgivings that I turned about to go in search of him. As I did so, I caught sight of his head projecting from behind a tree trunk at the edge of a small clearing only 100 yards away. When I raised my hand and beckoned, he disappeared into the undergrowth, but a little later, with drooping eyes and drooping ears, he crept silently to my feet. Laying down the rifle, I picked him up in my arms, and for the second time in his life he licked my face, telling me as he did so, with little throaty sounds, how glad he was to find me unhurt, and how terribly ashamed he was of himself for having parted company from me. Our reactions to the sudden and quite unexpected danger that had confronted us were typical of how a canine and a human being act in an emergency when the danger that threatens is heard and not seen. In Robin's case, it had impelled him to seek safety in silent and rapid retreat. whereas in my case it had the effect of gluing my feet to the ground and making retreat, rapid or otherwise, impossible. When I had satisfied Robin that he was not to blame for our temporary separation, and his small body had stopped trembling, I put him down, and together we walked up to where the leopard, who had put up such a game fight and had so nearly won the last round, was lying dead. I have told you the story, and while I have been telling it, Robin, the biggest-hearted and the most faithful friend man ever had, has gone to the happy hunting grounds, where I know I shall find him waiting for me. The End of Robin, from The Man-Eaters of Kumaon by Jim Corbett, read by Vijay Raol.